Hello and welcome to the third installment of Beards and Cars, Best and Worst Things About Owning Fill in the Blank. And this particular blank is a car which I used to own, the Maserati Quattroporte. And for those who are new to the channel, the previous two installments of my ownership experience were with the Volkswagen Touareg V10 and more recently the Jag XKR. Now, before I get into the pros and cons, there is one very important piece of advice that I want to give to any potential buyer of a modern, say post-90s Maserati. Do not buy a Cambia Corsa transmission car. At all costs, get a ZF if you can, be it the facelifted Quattroporte, be it a Gran Turismo. Cambia Corsas, in my opinion, are horrendous. My 2005 Quattroporte had one. What many people don't inform you of is that you essentially have to use the car as a manual, using the paddles all the time, because if you don't, and you let the car do its own thing in true automatic mode, it will proceed to eat its own clutch. That is a massive drawback, and it's something which you can find in this car, the 4200, I believe even the Grand Sport, so it's fine if you use the paddles all the time, but it essentially means that having an automatic at all is utterly pointless if you can't actually use it. I used it as one and it broke within 2 months of ownership. It would not engage drive, would not engage reverse. So my advice is, do not get a Cambia Corsa at all, save up the bit of extra cash, get yourself a Gran Turismo, or for instance like a 2009 I believe it is, facelifted Quattroporte. But with that to one side, let's jump into the pros and cons, and let's keep it positive first of all, because in a similar way to my experience with the Jag, one of my favourite things about the car, as you can hear at the start of this video, is the way it sounds. Of course, it's a huge draw, it's one of the biggest selling points to somebody who wants one in the first place, and the idea of this long 4-door 2-ton limo with an authentic Ferrari engine, essentially the base model of the F430 engine no less, it's a very enticing opportunity, and it sounds that great. However, the concept of that engine being in this car is something which I'm going to come back to later on, because it's not all sunshine and rainbows. In fact, I'm going to kind of come back to it now, because the first con is to do with reliability. Now, I'm not just going to dog on Maseratis being unreliable as most people do, and a lot of those people, let's be honest, have never actually owned one, they're just pundits. My issue is not reliability. I have no issue with a car that breaks. Every car ever made is going to break at some point, and that's a fact. What is not a fact, though, is that all cars are created equal when it comes to repairing them. And that is the Maserati problem. I would also liken it very much so to an Aston Martin problem. The Jaguar is so good, and I mentioned as much in its own video, because it has all of the status and panache and exotic nature of something like an Aston or a Maserati, but the repair parts, costs, and ease of actually working on the car are so much simpler and more attainable than the crazy kind of running costs and servicing, especially if you go to a specialist, that a Maserati or an Aston will have. That's just the way it is. So to me, that is a very notable drawback, and it all falls under that category that I've talked about on the channel before, wherein there is a huge difference between being able to afford to buy a car and being able to afford to run that car. That is where a Maserati or an Aston, and certain others as well, can sting you when they break down. Those costs, in the case of mine, it was going to be basically the price I paid for the car to get the car fixed, if not more. That's just not reasonable to me, and it's ultimately why I got rid of it. In other words, count the cost. Make sure that you can do a lot more than just afford to buy one. You need to be able to afford to live with one as well. The next positive, though, is actually something which, even compared to how much I love my Jag, impresses me more about this Maserati than my Jag does, and that is actually the handling. The Quattroporte is, even compared to the dozens of other cars, really high profile ones in some cases that I've reviewed here on the channel, Nissan GTRs, Maserati Gran Turismos, Aston Vanquishes and many more, I would still put my Quattroporte up there in probably the top 5 best handling cars I've ever driven. And the reason why is because its design is so unique. It's this really long 4-door limo, and yet it actually has more weight over the back end. and that in conjunction with a kind of small steering wheel and a relatively low slung centre of gravity means that through corners it does not feel anywhere close to the 2 tons that it actually weighs. In fact, as I alluded to, the handling on my Quattroporte is quite comfortably better than my Jag XKR, and that sounds crazy, but if you've driven both, I think you may agree with me. It's a difficult car to describe in terms of how good the handling is, but trust me, it's outstanding. The next issue which I have though goes back to that choice of engine. See, the concept of a Ferrari engine limo is awesome, or even just a Ferrari engine 4-door sedan in general. Just ask Lancia with the Thema 8.32. The problem comes though in terms of whether or not it's actually an effective application, and this is something which I talked about in my review of the Gran Turismo. See, this kind of engine works in a car like that, an exotic, super sports or GT machine. The problem with putting essentially a base model Ferrari F430 engine into a 2-ton 20-foot long limo is it's got no torque. It's working with like 330 pound-feet, which just isn't enough. And the result of that is it's far more thirsty than something like a Jag. It did less than 20 to the gallon compared to the 23 I get out of my Jaguar, a Jaguar which, by the way, has 20 horsepower more and about 100 pound-feet of torque more, and yet the Maserati just wasn't any more efficient because it's heavier, because it has no torque to work with in comparison to how it should feel. You compare it to the pulling power of an AMG or even something like an F generation BMW M5, yes, they have way more power, but it's the torque that makes all the difference in daily use. The result is you have to rev this engine much higher than you would, for instance, in my Jag to get that kind of same performance out of it. The result is you just end up spinning the rear wheels whenever you try and launch it fast, and I don't want that in my daily driver. The next positive thing about the car and the ownership of it is very much so tied into one of the reasons why I bought my Jag, and that is of course the panache, the presence, the style, and the wow factor of driving it, both as a driver inside the car and for other people to look at it. The Maserati has a certain status, which the Jag doesn't. The Jag is a beautiful car that everyone loves to look at, but you can't really argue with the fact that, as I said in that Jag video, there's something about a Jaguar which doesn't have the same presence as an Aston Martin or a Maserati. It has the same kind of advantages on paper, and it offers you all the best things about ownership of one, but there's just something about that badge which is more exotic, and even people who aren't car fans just kind of notice a Maserati more. It grabs your attention. So that was very much so a cool point about owning one, especially when any tunnels came along. The next downside though is again in reference to that gearbox, but also in reference to those tyres that I mentioned spinning up, because tied into the repair bills are the maintenance and consumables. And apart from the fact that the fuel economy is sub 20 to the gallon most of the time, it gets through rear tyres very quickly, more quickly than my Jag in fact, and it gets through clutches, as I said, unless you use it in paddle mode exclusively. So again, if you want to drive this thing like a super sports car all the time, swapping out rear tyres every few months, using paddles all the time and revving the nuts off the engine to get the best out of it, then by all means be my guest. The problem is everything I just said doesn't describe a 4-door limo. It also doesn't describe something remotely comfortable. It describes a sports car, and that's the issue. This isn't one. It's supposed to be a big, comfortable 4-door car. So those consumables are definitely something which you need to be prepared to basically just have your wallet on a chain on the outside of your pants to be constantly paying for. Speaking to that point of costs though, the next good point is something which counteracts the issue of maintenance, and that is the initial purchase price, the attainability of this level of exotic car. Because don't get me wrong, one of the main reasons why I bought one is because it's so ridiculously attainable. Here in the UK, 10 grand or less will comfortably get you a Quattroporte, especially at the time where I bought one, and they are starting to go up again a little bit now. That level of car, an authentic Maserati with daily usability and space, with that authentic Ferrari engine, the badge panache, the sound it makes, the performance, there are very few exotic or performance cars of this caliber and this status and pedigree that you can even get for remotely this kind of price. So that is a huge advantage if you are willing to take the risk. It is, in other words, a whole lot of car for the money. Now, the final not so good point that I want to get into is actually similar to something that I said in my Jaguar video. This one though is more specific. In the Jag, I mentioned some of the fit and finish wasn't quite up to the standard I would expect of a 60-70 grand car. In the case of this one, this was even more expensive than the Jag when it was new in 2005, especially again with that one-off paint colour. However, the issue which I have is actually something which is not just unique to me. A number of journalists and outlets have said such about Maseratis as well, not just this one, and that is that even though the interiors are very swoopy and stunning to look at, some of the buttons, some of the switchgear, some of the plastics used are a little bit cheap in terms of their look and feel, and I agree with that. Even though the general look of the interior is very impressive, I don't actually like some of the kind of low effort solutions that Maserati came up with when it comes to the plastics and switchgear. There's a way of doing plastic well. There are a number of supercars and exotics which have a number of plastic buttons all over the place, and yet it doesn't feel like a bad or cheap place to sit. Then there are other cars that just don't really even try. To me, Maserati doesn't put enough effort into those plastics, and as a result, my car actually used to creak quite a lot, at least after some time with ownership, and especially of course in the sun. Again, it's not a massive issue, but it's just kind of one of those things which you would expect more of from what, an 80, 90, 100 grand car when it was new. But we are going to end on my last positive because it is one that needs to be mentioned. Even though I believe this choice of engine was entirely wrong for the car, I do still think that a huge advantage of this vehicle from a potential owner, or in my case previous owner's point of view, is that for a genuine exotic, it's got a very, very impressive amount of space. For the driver, with me being 6'3" and not exactly a beanpole, I fit in the car very well. You can fit 5 adults in the car with plenty of legroom in the back, unlike a Jag XKR, which you basically need to be Douglas Bader to get in the back of. Plus the trunk space, although not ample, is fine for what it is. The space inside the cabin is very good. In fact, due to the shape of the car being kind of taller at the back, I believe there's actually a little bit more headroom for the rear passengers than there are for the people in the front, which isn't too surprising given that these were fairly popular in Italy for high-level politicians, etc. So that is my final positive point. Overall, my advice to potential Maserati aficionados or future owners is make sure you get one that has a good MOT history, not a service history. I've mentioned before in my Beards and Cars reviews, I put no faith and no stock whatsoever into service histories. They mean nothing to me because I've owned a car with the full book full and it meant nothing. What you should be looking at is researching online websites, and there are some really good ones out there where you can just input the license plate, or the number plate as we call it in the UK, of the car, and it will tell you that car's each year MOT history, the things it passed or failed or got recommendations of fixes for. It's much more telling than any service history booklet is. Make sure you look into that kind of stuff, check over the car maybe with a friend or an acquaintance who's a mechanic in fact, and be prepared that even if it's good, you're still going to have a lot of consumables, and potentially if it does break, you need to be prepared for how much those fixes could cost. The upsides are the stunning looks, the incredible road presence, the fantastic sound, great space, outstanding handling, and all things considered, really good performance. If though you want to check out those previous 2 videos about my other ownership experiences, probably primarily the Jag in fact in comparison to owning one of these, then of course you can click on screen here to see that one, or check out Beards and Cars as a playlist to see all of my car reviews, rival showdowns and buying guides. But until next time, I'll see you then. Stick around on the channel for more, and of course I'll see you next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.